for me now, what stands out as my bigger overarching responsibilities is it goes beyond my family, um, and more so with the community that I've built and the community that has found me in the last few years. Yeah, I think so much of that is also rooted in the Pacific Northwest Native Hawaiian diaspora. And that's also where my kapa making kind of in a roundabout way got started, when I was going to school in Oregon. And shortly after beginning my kapa journey, um, was when I started dancing hula again for a halau outside of Portland, Oregon. And, a lot of those people in our halau family are kanaka in diaspora. Um, and so doing what I can with the platform that I have as an artist and, a young kapa maker, using the skills and the voice that I have as a visual artist to empower our diaspora community, especially kids who maybe have never gone home to Hawaii. That's been super powerful. And like it's little things that are really the big things. A couple years ago I had an exhibition at the Portland Art Museum, um, which was really cool because, that was the first art museum I had ever been to, and I didn't go until I was like 17 years old. Um, and we went on like a class field trip. And I remember thinking like as a teenager, I was like, oh, that'd be so cool. Like what would it take to get my work in a place like this? Like, I had a very like limited view of like what being an artist was, but at the time I was just like, that'd be so cool. And then not even like 10 years later, my art is up in this beautiful gallery space. And like I had this kind of like this offshoot room kind of just to myself, like my own work. And I could have never imagined that. But one of the pieces that was in the show was a piece called Mana Mahu. And that was the first piece that I ever did with earth pigments and plant dyes that I gathered and made all myself. And I made the kapa for it as well, with some of the first kapa that I harvested with my kumu, Wesley Sen. And, it was kind of dedicated to my journey following not only kapa, but also kind of my journey in self-discovery and self-identity as a fluid or mahu individual. And I think that piece to me represents how those things go hand in hand. And, the museum is open to a lot of school groups, a lot of public schools, and educators bring their kids in for like little art tours and things like that. And I got an email like a few months after the exhibition had been opened, from a teacher who spoke about how one of their kids, who was a queer identifying Pacific Islander middle schooler, who just saw that work and couldn't stop just like glowing because they felt so seen and so validated in a way that, Monet paintings and Van Gogh just can't really touch on. Mm-hmm. And so for my work to have ripples like that, where, even years after making that piece, it's hung in a museum and some, kids can come by and out of a group of 20 classmates, one of them resonates with that work in a way that is similar to the experience I have as the person who made it. That's where I feel like my kuleana is. That's where I feel like my responsibility in not only representing our people, but also our people in diaspora and our people who kind of live on a spectrum of different identities. I think that's important. Yeah, it was like I said, it was one of the earlier pieces that I'd ever made on my kapa journey. So I'd really only been doing kapa for, I want to say maybe like a year or two at that point, if if 2 years. But I was learning so much at the time about like how to process the material, how it grows, how to harvest it, how to gather my own pigments to make paints, how different soils work together, how they don't, maybe um, different plant dyes and how I might be able to mix them together or maybe not. And so I was like learning so much about the material, and it really forced me to slow down and kind of change how I approach making work as an artist, because it's one thing to go to the store and buy your brushes and your paints and your canvas, and that's a very like immediate way of working. And then there's also the way of working with kapa, which demands its own slowness. Um, and I hadn't really worked in that kind of way before, but I was so excited. So,
Mm.
the patience, I guess, came with it. But in part of that process, I started learning more about more of the traditional gender, quote, quote, gender roles uh, that applied to kapa making through the kapu system. And while there is some fluidity, like there always is, between the roles for kane and the roles for wahine, um, generally speaking, the men made a lot of the tools, did the carving and whatnot, and the women were the ones who beat the material. And there were specified areas that um, were just for certain activities. So just for wahine, just for kane, and there was not really too much overlap. However, there were some cases where some individuals could move in between these two areas, and or some techniques that kane were allowed to do, like kane were allowed to make certain kinds of kapa that wahine were forbidden to make. And so I think learning more about this process and the fluidity of it at times really resonated with me. And I think the other thing important to note too is out of necessity today, a lot of kapa makers who don't identify as mahu, they make their tools and they beat the kapa. So they do both. They do everything because we're in a period of revitalization and reclamation. So learning as much as you can about all the different processes and doing them yourself has its advantages. Um, but for me, I feel like I started doing that less out of necessity, and it became more so about how I feel able to embody both spectrums, or both ends of that spectrum of kuleana, where it's not just my role as wahine to be kapa or my role as kane to carve the tools and that kind of thing. I think it's a more intentional way of doing both. Um, and there's no shade to people who do both out of necessity, because I think we need that as well, because we are revitalizing this practice. But just speaking from my experience, I think I approach it with a different mindset. My name is Lehuauakea. I was born in Portland, Oregon. My dad grew up in Salt Lake, We also have connections in Kalihi area as well. My grandparents live on the Hamakua coast up Hilo side in a small town called Papaiʻiko. So that's where I was raised. Shortly after I was born, my parents thought it was important for me to be raised with my grandparents and back home in Hawaii. So we moved back, and I lived there on the Big Island for several years up until I was starting fourth grade. So around, I want to say 10 years old. My family on my dad's side is connected to Big Island in at least, the last couple or several decades, I guess. We lived further up along the Hamakua coast in Pōhaku. And on that side of my family, we are kalas, kalavaias, paleas, and kawais. And on the Japanese side, we are kanos and hebarus and nomis. So lots of plantation history that we kind of all converged with on my dad's side. And a lot of that is mainly centered on Big Island and Oahu that I feel most connected to, but there's also some family lineage that's a little bit more extended, connected to Kauai and Maui. Being Kanaka, who also identifies as Mahu and feels comfortable with the term queer or gender fluid, I think it makes it easier to wrap my mind around my own identity and feel more comfortable in articulating it because of how much fluidity beyond gender and sexuality lives within the worldview that we have as Kanaka. So there's so much blurred lines that is intentionally blurred that lives within our mo'olelo, that lives within like all of our kupua and akua and the kino lao that they take the forms of. Sometimes multiple different deities can take the same kinds of forms, but maybe in different contexts or places or, and even when we talk about like the words that we have, the poetic quality, the kauna of our words, and the idea of makavalu, there being at least 8 different ways of seeing the same thing. I think, at least for me, it feels like easier for me to be comfortable in my own sense of fluidity because that's how I was culturally raised. Maybe not religiously raised, but culturally, with a Hawaiian kind of worldview. And so on that note, I feel that while I find, I identify comfortably as mahu or mahu wahine, but also gender fluid, or the larger like kind of umbrella term of queer. I do think there is distinction between the English terms of like LGBTQ and Mahu. I think there is a lot of overlap, I think, but with Mahu, it feels to me like there's more of a spiritual kuleana foundation. And with LGBTQ, I don't feel the same spiritual ties with those terms. And maybe that's because those terms to me don't come with the same Hawaiian cultural beliefs and terminology that Mahu comes with. So while I do often see those terms used interchangeably, I don't think that they are full replaceable translations of one another. I think sometimes it's kind of funny because my life feels like it's just a combination of so many different intersections, being born on the continent but raised back home in Hawaii, and then coming back to the continent and being part of the diaspora again. And then also being Kanaka, but being raised Japanese as well and being mixed. And then there's also like the aspect of the work that I do being like a kapa maker, cultural practitioner, but also finding spaces or, finding places for my work in contemporary fine art context, so like an artist practitioner, as my kumu auntie Dolani says. And then there's also the fact, that I don't feel fully, embodied by women or man identifiers, in the middle. And so like all these intersections like come together. Um, and that's where I belong, which feels sometimes a little contradictory because for so much of my life, I've felt like I'm too much of one thing to be this one thing, but not enough of another thing to be that other thing. So like I'm kind of just stuck in this middle ground. Um, but I feel like more and more that we have conversations about things like this and express our experiences and tell our stories, the more I find that people have really similar experiences themselves. Um, and I think it's beautiful to find relation on that level because, things I don't think are ever so cut and dry, so black and white. There's always a gray area where beautiful things can happen, where the nuances of those grays in the middle make you more unique and make you who you are. I don't feel like I'm just Hawaiian. I don't feel like I'm just a kapa maker. There's so much more to me and everyone, you know, um, and belonging to me feels like expressing those stories that make you not so one end of the spectrum, but realizing that we are able to find relation on many different levels because of all the intersections that we walk and embody.